Great, thank you. So I'm sure people will be joining us as we get started. I'm Shelby Thompson, the Senior Program Manager of Scale for Climatetech here at Second Muse. I've got my team here, Ryan Jones and Chris Licaradello. Sorry, I'm trying to pronounce that correctly, as well as our upstate partners in Rochester, NextCore. We run the Scale for Climatetech program, which most of you know is a manufacturing-focused incubator for early to growth stage companies ready to manufacture their products. Anthony Dixon from the NextCore team has also arrived. Mike Riedlinger, Jackie Amagon are all here with us today. Welcome, everyone. And we're running this event in partnership with our friends out on Long Island at the Clean Energy Business Incubator Program, also known as CBIP. So I'm going to hand it over to Shruti to say hello and give you a little brief on what the CBIP program is all about. Shruti?
Thanks, Shelby. Hi, everyone. I am Shruti Sharma. I'm the Program Manager for the Clean Energy Business Incubator Program. We are a NYSERDA-funded incubator, one of the 6 based out of Stony Brook University. We are a virtual incubator working with hardware-focused climate tech companies. We are technology agnostic, and we provide support to pre-seed all the way up to growth stage companies in terms of business as well as mentorship and programming. And I'll put out the link for our incubator application. We accept companies on a rolling basis. Very excited to be here with Shelby. This is a very important topic, I think, that comes up with our companies on a regular basis. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shruti. Shruti's right, this conversation comes up a lot. How to build a board of directors or advisory board. What are those boards? How do they work? How do you organize them? That comes up a lot with all of our companies as you scale up. So we came together, CBIP and I and our team, to make sure we could cover this well. So with that in mind, we invited a lot of amazing speakers here today. So I'm going to run through and let everyone introduce themselves quickly, and then we'll get started. So going in alphabetical order. So let's start with you, Bob. Bob, are you on mute?
Thank you. Okay, I'll start over again. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bob Cattell, and Shelby, thank you for inviting me to the session. I think I can probably say, without too much exception, I'm probably the oldest guy on the call. I spent my entire career in the energy utility business, and when I retired from my day job, as I called it, I got involved at Stony Brook, and we were able to build an advanced energy research technology center where I chair the advisory board. CBIT, we're honored to have CBIT located in the Advanced Energy Center. I also chair something called the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium. I'm involved with the Long Island Angel Network that invests in early stage companies. And I also sit on the board of some early stage companies. Old guy, have had a lot of experience.
Thank you, Bob. Good to have you here. Peter, over to you, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Bob, for reminding me to take myself off mute. Shelby, thank you very much for the invitation to join the panel. Very happy to do so. I also think this is an important topic and one that frequently gets overlooked. It is kind of a nuts and bolts issue that tends to be a non-sexy, exciting issue. But I think we overlook the subject and addressing it at our peril. And I can say from experience that that has certainly been my history with boards of directors and to some extent advisory boards. My background is, right now I am the Associate Vice President for Technology Partnerships at Stony Brook University. That entails a lot of what we understand to be economic development. It includes 6 incubators here at Stony Brook, all of which house startup companies, and we help them with issues like this. Previously, I was in consulting, did some big company work, did a couple of venture-backed startups. And I'm just mentioning that to give an idea of, I've dealt with boards in all of those roles. And I'm happy to share my experience, good and bad, about boards through the course of the panel.
Amazing. Thank you, Peter. Marcia?
Hi, Marcia Mitchell here. I'm a director at New York Ventures, investing across New York for Empire State Development, which is the economic development agency for the state of New York. The venture team manages direct equity fund investments into early stage companies, so pre-seed, seed, and A. And I have board seats at a couple of different startups ranging from consumer packaged goods companies to quantum. And despite their businesses being very different, they often face the similar problem of herding cats that are their board of directors. So I look forward to your questions about how to manage us folks.
Thank you, Marcia. Ari, over to you.
Yeah, great to be here with everyone today. My name's Ari Newman. I'm co-founder and managing director of a multi-stage venture firm called Massive. We're based in Boulder, Colorado, but we invest everywhere. And my background is on the entrepreneurial side. For the first part of my career, I started and exited a couple of different companies, going all the way back to the .com era. And I've been a full-time investor since 2012. I spent 6 years as a partner at Techstars, investing in the Techstars ecosystem and managing our capital over there before starting Massive in 2020. So great to be here. And I also have sat at all of the seats around the table: advisory board, board of directors, as a founder and as an investor. And so happy to share my perspectives here.
Great, thank you. And Tania, last but certainly not least, Tania, please.
Thanks for having us here. My name is Tania Pina, and I'm the founder and CEO of Renewable. Just to level set where we're at, we basically are headquartered in New York City, but our manufacturing facility is in Rochester, New York, where we ultimately take unrecoverable vegetative waste and we turn it into a number of technologies for indoor growing, essentially providing direct replacements for synthetics within the indoor growing market. We've been through the CBIT program. We've been through MCOR as, I think, the second cohort of Second Muse. And then lastly, we also benefited by going through and receiving support from NextCore, located here in Rochester. So hopefully that context, along with the fact that we're considered like pre-Series A, having raised $3 million, a little over $3 million to date, I hope to share with you my direct experience on this topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So happy to have everyone here today. All these different backgrounds should lead to a really lively discussion. For those of you who've just joined us, if you could do us a favor and update your name to your full name and your company if possible, so we can make sure we share the recording of this. And if the speakers are open to their contact info, we'll share that as well. No pressure. We will be moderating the chat. So if you have questions that pop up when you hear something come out of the discussion, I will do my best to incorporate it into the discussion as we walk through the panel. If we get to it later in the Q&A, we'll make sure to touch on that too. So please drop any questions or comments into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on it as well as the Scale team. And let's get started. So as we all know, and I said, we're here because advisory boards are forming, as you all are startups and investors in the community. Sounds like each of you have either created an advisory board, a board of directors, or have at least been on one. So I'd love to start by defining them for the audience so we know what we're dealing with. What do they do? How do you work with them best? So let's start with the advisory board. And Ari, I'm going to hand it over to you to give us just an overview of what an advisory board is and how do you work with them best?
Sure, happy to kick us off here. So from my perspective, advisory boards are best created to provide a group of domain experts or industry experts or operational folks that have relevant experience that can be helpful to the company. And really, what you want out of your advisory board is to have a group that are thought partners. Being a founder and a CEO is an incredibly lonely job, and you have to make a lot of hard decisions by yourself, often in a vacuum, very quickly. And using an advisory board allows you to have thought partners that share the same vision for the company and have shared success in mind, but have different experiences to bring to the table. So when you're dealing with something challenging or you're looking for new opportunities, it's a great way to not have to go it alone, and also to like leverage experience. When, for most founders, when you're doing something new, it might be the first time you're faced with that decision. Imagine the power of having 4 or 5 other people that have been there and done that, almost regardless of what's going to come up for you. So that's, from my perspective, having those thought partners and having people with relationships, experience, and perspective that might be different than yours helps the company in very strategic ways, because you've got a much larger collective pool of experience to pull from.
Thank you, Ari. Marcia, how does a board of directors differ from an advisory board?
Yeah, so the board of directors is the governing body of a company, and they typically meet at regular intervals, similarly to the board of advisors, but to review and discuss ongoing business strategy and help the company make key decisions, and in some cases help to hire senior level talent. So they make these decisions as a fiduciary, which I think is what really distinguishes them from the advisory board. They have a duty to the shareholders as well as to the company, obviously, to keep everything above board and all the transactions legal, et cetera. But in addition to like finding senior leadership, compensation, and M&A activity, they're very supportive to the company in that way. And I think the best way to work with a board is to see them, as Ari said, as thought partners and also accountability partners. A great board helps the startup set goals that are ambitious and attainable, and really helps them reach those goals by providing insightful guidance and with connections to other important partners. So as I said, as I already mentioned, like having that group of people, whether it's, 2 founders and an investor, or it's a 5-person board and there's lots of other players in the room, it's really important to have, people on your board who are focused on the well-being of the company, let's say.
So those 2 boards sound like they're really focused on your business and your strategy and your growth. Peter, when we were chatting, it sounds like there's also an opportunity to have a scientific advisory board or an SAB who may be more in tune with your technology. Can you speak about that?
Sure. A scientific advisory board is among those that Ari addressed. So it is not a board of directors. It is an advisory board, typically without authority or decision-making capability. It's very, very typical in science and engineering-based startups where you want specific expertise in your field who can guide and make recommendations for you. So everything that Ari said about an advisory board, and this just happens to be a specific type that is very typical for deep science and engineering related startups. You find expertise here, perhaps to differentiate. Typically, some of the board members who join, the board of directors people who join, will have some expertise from a science standpoint, but it's typically not spot on in the company's technology, and you want further, deeper expertise. And that's what you ask of your SAB.
Makes sense. Tania, have you had experience with each of these kinds of boards, or have you focused on one particular board? How did you formulate that board, and when was the right time for you as a startup founder?
Yeah, I mean, I think in our case, it was a little bit untraditional or non-traditional in the sense that, a lot of our early team members turned into advisors because of the fact that we had relocated from what was the DC area to New York early in our days. And so I felt it was appropriate to convert them into advisors because the passion was still there. They wanted to really still be a part of the progress of the company. And there was still a lot of kind of strategic or I should say, and scientific contributions that they were able to lend to our product development and to overall just kind of like process development in our early days. And so, in time, I think advisors to us was our early team while we were still leveraging what were contractors, consultants, before we truly hired full-time staff. And I think that was helpful to us remaining agile while we were still being very iterative in parallel to getting a lot of advisory level feedback from MCOR, from CBIP, and other resources. So I'll talk about this more later, but I think it's really helpful to, the founders to understand, and CEOs to understand that, be really discerning of each individual's contribution as an advisor, because any gaps within that you may be able to get from other ecosystem partners or support networks.
Bob, from your experience being on multiple boards of all kinds, how many boards have you been on? You mentioned quite a few. You don't have to have a direct number. And were you brought in early, as Tania suggested, as a team was formulating, or later on because of investor request? How did your relationship with boards formulate?
Remember to unmute, Shelby. Thank you. I won't go into how many boards I've been on. It's been a lot. But I think relevant to this discussion, it kind of goes back to Ari's comments. I think you want to start an advisory board early in the process, get them on board, make them partners with you, because, Ari touched on it, it can be very lonely at the top, particularly when you're a sole entrepreneur, a founder. So I think it's important to get people who, are compatible. I think that's very important to have, an advisory board that's compatible. That doesn't mean that they're going to yes you to death, but you want them to be supportive of what you're doing. The other thing about the reason to have an advisory board and a board of directors early in the game, when you start going out looking for investments, one of the things that I look at when I look to invest in companies is who's on their advisory board and also on their board of directors. So I think early on, you want to have a collegial relationship with your board and your advisory board. But again, you don't want them to yes you to death. You want them to give you constructive criticism as it's needed.
Great segue into what are the different kinds of folks that you may have on your board. Ari and Marcia, I'll turn you a little bit on this. We were discussing roles such as an observer, an outsider, an actual investor, someone who has compensation, which we'll get into. But what are the different roles that people can play that you've started to touch on? Ari, we can start with you.
Sure, and to follow on the segue. So when we're talking about advisory boards, and when we use the term board, that typically means a group of people with formal meeting cadence and a lot of structure. And I just want to remind everybody that it's the substance that matters, not the structure. You could have the most formal advisory board thing. You could have an advisory board chair and hand out titles and equity. And if you meet with them once a quarter and they have no ongoing information, you're just reporting to yet another body, and it's just creating more work for you. And then their ability to react, engage, and be thoughtful is limited. So it's about the substance, it's about the cadence and the open communication. If you have one or two people that want to help you, you can make them advisors. You don't have to form an advisory board until you get to a sort of critical mass, maybe 3 or more people, where meeting together for the group dynamic is really powerful. So to answer the question, Shelby, for advisors or advisory boards, I'm not big on separate titles or roles. Remember that advisory boards are non-voting. They have no ability to control the decisions of the company. They are influence and support roles, essentially. The board of directors is the one with the fiduciary responsibility and actual voting roles. And depending on the size of the company, you might have on the board of directors side, you might have a board chair, or you might not. Typically, the CEO of the company sort of acts as the board chair for early stage companies. And the only difference between a board member and an observer is whether they actually get a vote on matters that require voting or approval, like stock options, compensation, hiring, et cetera.
Right, and those voting, rules, I guess, are usually outlined in the documents, in the legal documents that you're putting forth to close your round in the beginning. So you might have, 1 or 2 people who actually have voting rights and a few others who are observers. And I think there can be a really good relationship between those people, but obviously, there might also be some times where the observers have to step off the call and let the directors have an executive discussion to discuss maybe key decisions about talent or other things. But yeah, to your point about like the substance on a board, it really does. It really is important to have people who have experience on both sides. I think someone like Ari is like a J-Lo, like you've got all these different talents and you can kind of weasel your way, wield your wield your experience really helpfully. But some people have really focused on VC, and they've been a VC since they were 22, and that comes with a lot of helpful insight as well. So it's good to have a good mix of people who've had experience on all sides.
When you're forming a board of directors and you're an early stage company, it sort of follows this pattern where like the co-founder or the two co-founders will be on the board, and they would essentially represent common, which means they represent the bulk of the shares owned by the company. Then an investor shows up, and eventually a lead investor from a seed round, may end up joining the board, and they represent preferred, which means that they are actually voting as a member of the board to protect the interests of the preferred shareholders if the company has issued preferred stock. And then if you have one founder and one investor, you need a third person, so you have a tiebreaker, and that person is usually an outside director is the term that's used, and ideally they're from industry, or their primary objective and mindset is, how do we support this company's growth and evolution in the healthiest way possible? Because you might find that in a board vote, let's say the founder wants to give themselves double the salary, or do a deal where the existing investors are going to get diluted, and the investor says, absolutely not, we're not getting diluted. So you need a tie break in those. So the simplest setup is common, preferred, outside director. And then as the company grows or raises more money or gets more complex, more and more people come in. But ultimately, my guidance is always have an odd board so that you have a tie break, and have all views evenly represented the best you can.
Interesting. Peter, have you approached accountability with your board in light of what's been shared from the rest of the panel? And how do you define that clearly for folks? And we will get to handle confidentiality and all of the other questions that are popping up, but let's start with just accountability with your board and making them understand what their role is.
Yeah, good concept. And it's important to understand accountability works both ways. The board holds the CEO and the company accountable, but the board itself and the individuals also need to be accountable. And every now and then you have somebody on the board who is not fulfilling their obligation. Ultimately, you want your bylaws or articles of incorporation to provide for how a board member is removed. It will never be as simple as you have a disagreement with somebody and you want to remove them before there is a vote you think you might lose. That's going to be the worst way to hold people accountable. And there are usually very straightforward ways to do that are well-defined, well-accepted, and easy to adopt them in how you run your board and how the board functions. But hopefully, and maybe borrowing on some of Ari's comment, you manage problems with board members well in advance of them becoming large issues. I do think it's important to set mutually agreeable expectations in both directions. What will the CEO and the company provide on a regular basis? What are performance metrics? And what the expectation of each board member is. Ari's right. Typically, the board members represent a particular interest group, but they are also there for broader purposes to assist the company, and you want to take advantage of that. And it is a reasonable expectation to expect them to contribute.
Tania, in your experience with having some people who sort of have been along for the journey all along versus those who you've brought in later, have you felt that it was up to you to define the relationship, or did you define it together? How did that work for you as a founder?
Yeah, ours is a unique case in that right now our board consists of myself, our COO, and then 2 board observers. So not any board of directors. And that was only intentional in the fact that given that we really maintain a very transparent open door policy with our financials, we do monthly investor update emails, soon transitioning to a quarterly webinar to make it a little bit more efficient for me. And so I think, my expectations in terms of who it should be on our board. I wanted it to be aligned with those that were more strategic in the industry. And of those VCs that have invested in us to date, they didn't require, nor do they have the bandwidth to be on our board. So anyone that we raise from that is well entrenched in the ag tech industry, invest at an institutional level, that'll definitely be something that I'm personally looking for to be on our board, because we do want that level of expertise, that credibility, authority. We just hadn't had it in the past. And so, yeah, I hope that answered your question, Shelby.
Peter, you also mentioned bylaws. I've heard articles of incorporation. For those in the audience who are maybe earlier stage and don't have those yet in their business, maybe even don't even have a mission statement fully formed, how do you go about including those and formulate those? Bob or Peter, either one of you who have experience in developing those, feel free to answer that.
I'm happy to jump in. So if you have formed a legal entity that is not a sole proprietorship, you probably have bylaws and articles of incorporation and you're not aware of it. To form the legal entity, the Secretary of State in the respective state where you've incorporated or formed will require you to have some form of those documents. And you may just have defaulted to a standard template that if you, particularly in the case if you used any sort of assistive service to form the company. But what I would strongly recommend is that you do get your hands on those documents and review them and know what's in them. Those documents do change. I think the investors on the panel have highlighted this. When you go through a round, typically the board changes, and very frequently bylaws and articles of incorporation change as well to reflect growth and changes in the company, certainly in board makeup and how many there are and who will represent.
Is the note of compensation included there, or is that something that you should consider when inviting folks to join your board, whether if it's in kind, with equity, a paid compensation position? How does that work? And Bob, have you had experience in?
Yeah, I was going to, before I get to the compensation issue, you talked, Peter Talked about the legal requirements and bylaws. You talked about mission statement, which is separate from the legal documents, but very important. And that, in my opinion, is a very important role for the board to play with the CEO, developing the mission statement. In my opinion, one of the most important roles for the board, in addition to, and this could be both advisory and a fiduciary board, is obviously to support the CEO. But in that context, to also help the CEO with the strategy, developing the strategy for the company going forward, based on the experience they've had, and to give that input. So I think that's an important role for the board to play with the CEO. As far as compensation goes, early stage companies don't have much cash. Cash is always king, but even more so. So I think when I think about early stage companies, I think it's important to compensate certainly the fiduciary board and maybe even the advisory board in stock. Give them some ownership in the company so they truly, quote, have some skin in the game. And as the company does well, then they can do well. So I think that's how I think about it, particularly in early stage companies.
Marcia or Ari, have you seen that on the investor side when you've joined a board or been invited to?
Yeah. I mean, my experience has always been that the only compensation for early stage companies on the board of directors side is for the outside director, right? And so if you have the configuration I talked about before, the founders already own equity, the investor already owns equity. If you invite someone else who's not otherwise economically involved in the company, Bob's absolutely right. Pay them for their time and their efforts with a little bit of equity. And certainly a board of advisors or an advisory group that's going to be expected to meet monthly, quarterly, be available on demand, actually show up and do some lifting, introductions, and networking on behalf of the company. A little bit of equity is great there. I actually just joined early stage SaaS company as an advisor this week. So I just signed the agreement. It's all fresh to me. Something I've done for 20 years off and on. So absolutely fair. you want some shared upside, right? If the company becomes wildly successful, it's probably not going to be life-changing money, but it's a nice win, and that kind of compensation makes sense. When companies get larger, growth stage companies, pre-IPO companies, cash compensation makes a lot of sense. Those companies are typically have much stronger balance sheets, and the existing investors become even more conservative around issuing stock because they believe the stock becomes more valuable than the equity. And there's a flip that happens there. So companies go from early stage to growth.
Marcia, anything to add to that?
No, I just thinking about, the small amounts of money that, investors might ask for travel or other, little things that come up. But, we actually tried to minimize those as much as possible and not really, hold those companies accountable for them at the early stage. A $500 plane ticket can sometimes be, the difference between making payroll and everything else. So yeah, there's still a sort of like, once you're invested in the company as an institutional VC or even, a corporate VC, there's really no need for any kind of compensation outside of what, the returns are at the end, hopefully.
That's actually a great point that you make that we should bring up a bit more to clarify. When in a lot of term sheets at seed or Series A or Series B, the lead investor that's joining the board will stipulate that their travel and expense related to board meetings needs to be covered by the company. And if the company has an existing T&E policy for what's acceptable expense, you can simply edit the draft and say, per accordance with the existing corporate T&E policy to protect yourself. If the company does not have that in place, absolutely cap it. Because I have seen all sorts of egregious behavior. I've invested in a seed stage company that was like pre-revenue, and I had a VC join the board and demand first-class tickets and 5-star hotels. And when I pushed back as another investor saying, we need to hold on to our cash and run the company, not take care of your T&E, I got all sorts of arm waving about how this person hasn't flown in coach in 20 years and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it has to be appropriate for the stage of the company.
Yeah, we just say take it up with Amex. Like if you are a VC running a company and you want to fly, first class to LA, get your points, but don't put that on the company. That's irresponsible.
100%.
It sounds like a very clear term sheet is required to make sure that everyone feels invested, but also protected in this relationship. Does the term sheet also cover confidentiality, liability? So how does a startup protect your advisory board from liability is one question. And then the confidentiality, I think we can touch on in relation to the term sheets with IP, NDAs, et cetera. Tania, Ari, go ahead, and then I'll hand it over to Tania to speak on behalf.
Tania, do you have a formal advisory board now?
Yeah, and I was going to say, Shelby, I can send you a template agreement if you want to forward it to everyone. It does include confidentiality clauses within it. It does treat it as, similar if it were a traditional NDA agreement. They have to abide by the same type of restrictions. And so there was a question around IP. The good thing is that we really, for our advisors, the way I've treated it is we'll receive feedback for a very specific, let's say product focused question that is IP sensitive, but I can control how much information they have access to by not sharing, what that impact of their feedback was, if I'm very sensitive to, the IP. And so I think it just comes down to how much you're willing to share, and being able to control the spheres of communication, because it can either make your life easier or more challenging depending on who knows what.
Is that also related to the role that they play? So if they're an observer, they may not receive as much information as someone who has voting rights?
That's correct. That's correct. I mean, at least for us, it's kind of, we're not Apple by any means, but you only are given information on an as needed basis. So, there are some people on our team that don't know our process in full detail because they don't need to. So it's just made, honestly, my life a lot easier. And that's how we've kind of controlled any information leak.
Makes sense. Ari, what were you going to add to that?
The advisory board agreement that I just signed is structured more like a consulting or contractor agreement, where any ideas or any inventions that I come up with or are discussed in the advisory board context are the IP of the company. So I'm agreeing to an IP rights assignment in the construct of supporting the company with ideas. And then there's a section around expectations, cadence, deliverables, and compensation.
Peter, were you going to comment on that too?
Yes. So I think absolutely everything that Ari and Tania said about confidentiality agreements and consulting agreements, they have a very specific purpose. They're a good tool, but I would also observe they have their limitations, and don't overlook your common sense or gut instinct on listen, is it sensible to share information with everybody here? You know, Tania's talking about limiting what you share with who. We see this issue pop up on scientific advisory boards frequently when a company is building, let's say, a high profile advisory board because that's good for the company. There's a good reason to do that. But in the process of doing that, you may be adding competitors or consultants that advise competitors, and you should know about those relationships, and advisors should be disclosing them. There may be a way to manage the possible conflicts there, but there's also a point at which you simply don't want to invite some people to join your boards.
Interesting. And then I think goes to a question from the audience, from Miles, on structuring and governance of a board. Is that tied to that, Peter, in your opinion?
In terms of the board of directors, I think you get pretty good structure out of first articles of incorporation and bylaws, and then however they are modified through respective deals or other events. For advisory boards, it's much more fluid. I do think you should have an idea in mind of what you want from your advisory boards and discuss and agree it specifically with the individuals and the group. What is the ask of those individuals going to be? It's same as the board. You want to have clear expectations that are well defined and what your ask of them is, and therefore how you're going to measure whether or not they're making that contribution.
Makes sense. Bob, in your experience, how long have you been on a board? Do you stay on for 1 year? And I know that I'm sure the agreement and the scope changes.
Well, I think that's an important thing that should be worked out in advance. I think it's important to have term limits for directors, and that's usually as part of the bylaws. Typically 3 years are typical, and directors can be reelected perhaps for a second, but then maybe not for a third. So I think that's all got to be laid out. I think it's important for the director to be on long enough so that they can contribute, but you also want to have some turnover on your board and get new people, particularly, I'm talking about the board of directors now, more than the advisory board. But that's usually covered in your bylaws, term limits and things of that nature. Directors are usually reelected at an annual meeting. Just touching on the governance thing, there's some very specific good practices that should be followed when you're setting up a fiduciary board, from a governance standpoint, meetings, audit committees. Now, recognizing early stage companies don't have huge boards, so you got to be a little judicious in how you do that. But there's some specific good governance principles that should be followed.
I can add one thing there. If you're an early stage company and you have not run a board of directors or don't have experience around board cadence, it's great to bring someone in that has to help make sure that you do it right. There's lots of little things like meeting minute approval, documenting key decisions, and just how to actually run the board meeting in a consistent, and professional way, where when the company either gets audited, the next round investors show up, or an issue shows up, the trail of governance of the company is clean and easy to follow. And one hack for founders out there that are thinking, wow, this is a lot of crap I have to deal with. Your corporate lawyer, in almost all cases, corporate lawyers for early stage companies will sit in on your board meetings and take minutes for free. Do not let your lawyers charge you to take minutes. Well, from in my experience, the good corporate lawyers that work with a lot of startups, that's just part of the service they provide. And they the template is really simple. Not everything that's said in the meeting ever goes into the notes, but that's an important step, is documenting that the meeting happened, who was in attendance, what key decisions got made, did we issue equity, did we hire anyone, did we fire anyone, etc. Get your lawyers to do it, make them do it for free, and do this stuff at a consistent cadence, and you'll thank yourself much later on.
So you don't need an intern to take notes at your advisory board meeting. You can ask your attorney. Love that hack, or rather tip. Let me say that better. In the same vein, what should you be communicating during those meetings? And it could depend on the board, I'm assuming, but it sounds like you need to have a clear agenda, some clear action items for people to take away, expectations. Tania, you've included me on some of your communications over email to some of your advisors. Do you want to speak on what you feel like is a value add to your board members and what you like to share with them to keep them in the loop, and where you are and where you need help?
Yeah, I think we haven't made any difference between our investor communication as with our board of advisors. And I think that just simplifies my life. So, we report our KPIs, what we're working on in terms of product sales, the team, and overall kind of goals. But try to keep us, you were mentioning about accountability. We kind of have a dashboard that we kind of keep a regular cadence to. And so both internally, we're measuring ourselves against that, but we also are keeping ourselves accountable to our board with that information as well. And so to keep my life simpler or simple, I keep the same investor update email. I also include our board of advisors on.
Makes sense. I've got a couple more questions for the group, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. This is for everyone. I'll start with Marcia. What are some really great specific calls to action that you've received from your board to get you to continue, and how are they communicated to you?
Oh, do you mean like for a founder?
Yep.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really love to see, even something as simple as attending roundtables with other people in their similar position. I think there's a lot to be gained in the community from sitting with other people who are doing what you're doing. And that can be, working with, like at my previous firm, we had roundtables for CFOs, for CTOs, for CEOs, and you'd glean a lot of information just from that. And instead of feeling like you're in this echo chamber with, naysayers on your board, or like people who are just pumping you up, like having that relatability with your peers essentially can help a founder go from, someone who's a neophyte coming out of the pre-seed woods into like a real strong Series A and eventually Series B founder, and just keep level setting for them as to like what their expectations are. So calls to action, I think, are, spend more time with your peers, like even like going on vacation, like taking care of yourself as a person. Like that was one that we had to, getting a personal, like a life coach. We had a CEO who was like a charred match. Like he was burnt out beyond belief. And and he's a brilliant man, and he really just needed a break and to come back to it and, give himself a week. And we made him do that. And he came back and, started eating again and sleeping again. I mean, sometimes it gets to that point where you need someone else to tell you to relax. So that's something as simple as that could be good.
Peter, how about you? Have you had some really great call to actions for you as a board member, or call to actions you've specified that you've seen the same reply as Marcia? Oh, you're on mute. Ryan, can you unmute Peter, please? I asked unmute, but I can't do it. Sorry. There we go.
That's all right. We're at cross purposes there, but that's okay. Thank you for the reminder again. Yeah, calls to action that come most quickly to mind for me are really when there is a substantive or possibly substantive change in the outlook for the business. So not necessarily of the type that Marcia is talking about, but more, hey, did the environment change? Did we have a miss in terms of one of our major objectives? Did we miss timing on a funding round and need to downsize or limit the scope of the business, preserve cash? The board plays a critical role in those instances, possibly even frequently seeing them more clearly than the CEO can, who can sometimes he or she have rose-colored glasses on, and it's just always stay the course. We're on track. We'll catch up next quarter. We don't need to change anything. Despite the fact that your burn rate says you're going to run out of cash before you could possibly raise more money.
Yeah. Bob, how about you? Any great calls to action that have really inspired you or pushed you forward to help a team grow?
You're also on mute just before you.
Got to keep remembering to get off mute. My apologies there. I think it's important that the CEO bring problems to the board, early warnings. And obviously, if the board members see anything, the CEO should know about it. But I think that type of communication is important, that boards are there also to help the CEO. So if there are any red flags on the horizon or things of that nature, I think it's important for the CEO to advise the board members so that they can assist him in solving those problems.
Thank you. Ari?
Yeah, I love it when there's something specific and actionable. I had something come up just the other day where one of the companies I'm on the board of needs a particular type of regulatory lawyer. So the ask went out, like, can you help us with introductions for something specific that the company needs to move forward? Or, as discussed before, if there's going to be material changes to the outlook for the company or the trajectory, what can we do to help to engage or help address those issues? One other comment I'll add about boards of directors, and as someone who is both, you run a board from a founder side as well as been on one as an investor, is the board meeting should be a discussion. If you find yourself as a founder showing up at the board meeting and presenting your board deck or reporting to the room, you've already failed. So you need to send the materials ahead of time. The board should already be up to speed. And if there's going to be bad news, call each board member, proactively share the bad news, have a discussion. Don't ever drop the bombs in the boardroom at the meeting. That way, the meeting is a discussion about how to support you as the founder and the company and solve the problems together and move forward. If you end up in a dynamic where the board meeting is a reporting session, you're actually not getting a lot of value out of that engagement. Just my perspective.
No, I'll second that. That's a very important perspective. The board meeting should be discussion, not just reporting. There's certain things you have to report, but really you want to engage the board in the discussion area. That's a really good point.
Tania, I'm sure has been your experience, but love to hear from you on utilizing the board as a conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree fully with Robert and Ari, and in the sense that there's some questions that we try to keep open-ended so that we can raise more discussion and just keep it still moving in a timely basis for those 2 hours that we have of their time. And then there's other questions that, whether we've had a prior conversation to Ari's point with each advisor or certain ones, we can build that or incorporate that in the agenda so that everyone can kind of see everyone's feedback and we can quickly reach a decision within that amount of time.
Makes sense. A few things I want to touch on that came in from the comments and questions is we started to talk about equity. A few folks have asked, what is a typical equity you've seen? Thank you, Tania, for answering 0.25% to 1% is a fair baseline. Or do others want to contribute to any fair equity you've seen? Marcia, Ari?
I really like Tania's answer. I think that gives some insight, because a lot of this stuff is, most people have never heard of these things and I don't know where to start. So yes, 0.25 to 1% is great. There's some people who might, be able to bring in a little bit under 2%, and that's awesome. But like, Tania mentioned, having a weighted, understanding between each different advisor is really important, because you might have a lot of people as your advisors early on, and you don't want to be giving away, 10% of your company straight away. So I think thinking about like, what's the cadence of communication with that person? What's the expectation from you that they'll respond when you need them? What's the actual weight of their insight? What's their level of expertise? Is it legal? Is it business strategy? Is it, consumer, expectation or what have you? So I think that was a really apt answer. But yeah, there's a couple questions in there about advisory board, and I know that you'll probably get to those.
I have a slightly different approach with it. So a quarter of a point to a full point is a huge swing. And if you're going to have an advisory board of 4 people plus an outside director on your board of directors, you can end up giving away 5% of the company in a year for some input. And I think that's a lot, right? So the setup around whether it's a quarter point or a tenth of a point or 2 points is what is the role? Are they on a vesting schedule? And what is the duration? How many years is that over? So for example, the advisory board that I just joined is a pre-seed stage startup. My comp is 0.33 and it vests over 1 year. And if the relationship doesn't work in a quarter, I get nothing. If I get to the end of the year, I'll have the full third of a point. If I want to continue next year, we will figure out an appropriate amount. If the company goes and raises a big seed round and has a $25 or $30 million post-money valuation after the next round, my comp as an advisor might need to go down to 0.15, right? Because of the share price going up. So, if you're setting up a board of advisors, don't hand out the shares just fully vested out of the gate. Have it on a schedule, and then think about how long you want that engagement to last. You might have utility for a board of you might have utility for an advisor for a short period of time or a long period of time. It's a lot easier to have these relationships auto renew than it is to sign up for something for 4 years, then have to terminate it because nobody feels good about that.
Are convertible notes an option as well, rather than a percentage? That's a question from the audience.
Yeah. The problem with a convertible note or a safe, is that the advisor actually has to pay for it at some point versus it just being a grant, right? So having a non-qualified option or even a warrant where there's no requirement to put up cash in order to get the value of the shares later. And then also you have to think about that from a tax standpoint as well.
Bob or Peter, are there resources, even if it's at Stony Brook or elsewhere, that startups can refer to decide what percentage they should be offering as an equity?
Absolutely. I would say they're not exclusive to Stony Brook. I think your corporate attorney is generally a very good source. There are also very well accepted sites where template documents that have been pretty well vetted by the community are available. I think Y Combinator has a set that's used pretty frequently. I think Cooley, a law firm, has a set that's used pretty frequently. If I
NVCA also. There's a website called Cooley Go, and you can actually generate industry standard corporate documents for free on Cooley Go. That are very fair to the company, and you can turn on and off all the knobs based on how you want to set things up. And then the National Venture Capital Association also publishes a set of industry standard documents as well.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, not at all.
We'll add those to
I don't think I can add anything to that, but there are places to go to get that information.
Well, Bob, for you, I've got a question from the audience is, what's an ideal board size at a seed stage versus a Series A? This particular founder has 4 co-founders all on the boards. Is that what's a great answer for that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think, early stage, a smaller board is better. And you need to leave room if you're going to have other investors come in, they may want a place on the board. So an early stage company, and Ari can probably talk better to this than I can, maybe 4 is a good number to get started with and leave a little bit of room. You don't want the board to be so large that it gets unwieldy, and certainly you don't want to put more of a burden on the CEO. They've got enough things to do. So I think smaller in the beginning is better, and maybe 4 is a good number to start. I've seen it as low as 2 or 3, But I think and then you may want to have an odd number so that you know that you can break ties. But Ari, you probably have a lot of experience in that regard.
I think that's all spot on. The only thing I would add is, and this is for founders. It feels good and rewarding for four co-founders to be on a board together. It's an additional title. It feels like you have a fiduciary responsibility. But what's going to happen if you raise outside capital is that 3 of the 4 co-founders are going to be removed from the board. So the minute you raise money from an institutional investor that's going to join the board will be reconfigured probably to 3 people, the CEO, the new investor, and then an outside director. So now you've got your 3 co-founders that are going to very quickly be removed from the board, which puts a bad taste in their mouth and makes them feel marginalized. And so just be careful going into the setup that you know how the board is likely to evolve over time, and those expectations are set.
Yeah, and I maybe just looking at that from the beginning of it. I think 4 co-founders on a board is unusual, and that's probably a high number. And while I don't know the particular circumstances here, when I have seen that in the past, it is typically the result of not making a clear distinction between the management team and the board. And those are 2 very different things. And it's better to have that discussion and make the distinction early on rather than punt on it. And a lot of very early stage companies do punt on that. And the management team is the same as the board, and that defeats the purpose of that separation.
Makes sense. All right, we're down to our last minute, and it looks like we've wrapped up our questions. So I'd love to just hear any last thoughts or one piece of advice that everyone on the panel would like to share. Tania, please kick us off with a final thought for everyone.
Yeah, I would just, for me, like I said, to keep things super easy, I try to lead with transparency. And just keeping it open communications. And I think also that helps with the relationship with investors, because they've been more willing to follow on, and they've been more willing to refer us to other investors because of that trust and integrity. So I say lead with that.
Amazing. Ari?
My advice is, as soon as you're able, set up some type of advisory group or a odd number board, even at early stage. The benefit around the corporate hygiene and the consistent cadence and the internal accountability that comes with it is extremely helpful for the company, and it accelerates hiring, fundraising, growth, or M&A if the company gets early interest as well. And I know a lot of founders that kick the can on setting up board of directors because they feel like it's going to be more overhead and more work and more distraction. But I do think that there's a happy medium where you can do it in a really lightweight, friendly way. And as Tania has said so many times, like, transparency and engagement is so important. It doesn't need to be an antagonistic relationship, but if you have some thought partners around the table that have experience around scaling companies in corporate hygiene, you can react as a business to things really quickly and professionally. And I think ultimately it helps. The other thing is that if you are missing steps, if you're not actually doing the things that need to be done from a corporate and operations standpoint, eventually you have to pay for that. And it's much harder you can't go back in time. In companies, you can only go forward. So if you have a whole bunch of stuff that got broken because you didn't know any better for 2 or 3 years, then you get a board and you realize, oh, whoops, we have to go fix a lot of things. The level of effort to go back and fix things is like 5 times as high as if you had just done it right out of the gate.
Thank you. Marcia?
Yeah, I something stuck out to me. I think it might have been something Bob said, but about being preemptive in regards to issues on your board and nipping things in the bud very early, even if it's a miscommunication or bad vibes, having the confidence in yourself as a leader in the same way you would with people that, work under you or work for you, you would sort of manage up with your board and sort of preempt any major issues that are coming up between personalities or disagreements about strategy, because I'm sure there's an adage that I'm forgetting, but a pound of prevention or something like that, something about prevention versus I think I'm showing my age being too young to know what these adages are, but it's really important to get out ahead of those issues as early as you can.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, I'll borrow part of a comment Ari offered earlier, and along the lines of, if you're new to boards and haven't done one before, and if you're particularly the CEO and need to create one, it is critical for a lot of reasons. But if you haven't done it before, it's hard to know what you should be doing. And so find somebody who can help you and advise you. They don't have to be on the board. They could be your corporate attorney. They could be someone who has just been there and done it before. Maybe they're on your board, maybe they're not, but try to get an accelerated learning curve going on how to run a good board of directors.
Amazing. Thank you. All right, Bob, close us out with your
Well,
great.
I just want to echo what's been said. Sooner rather than later, try to get people who can help you and give you good advice. And the last comment I'll make is you do need to be a little selective about who you put on a board, because it may be easier to get them on. It's very difficult to get them off. So you want to have people, not that they're going to yes you to death, but who are going to be constructive and can help you grow the company. Because getting somebody off the board is much more difficult than getting somebody on the board.
Right. So don't just invite someone to join your board to prove that you're a vetted company, for example.
Right.
Great advice, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you to our partners at CBIP for helping us pull together this amazing panel. You all have such great wisdom and insight. I appreciate you letting us record it. We will share this with the audience who's been here today with us. And if they have any follow-up questions, we'll be sure to forward them your way. And thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Great
It's
job.
a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Shelby.
Thank you.
Take care.